All right. But when we do that, notice that I'm getting a red squiggly line under the word message. The name message doesn't exist in the current context. All right, so we're going to talk about scope and declaring variables inside of certain scopes in a little bit, but just to kind of lead up to that conversation, essentially, when we've defined a variable inside of an inner scope, it's not available outside of that scope. In other words, if we define a variable inside of a code block, inside of the curly braces, it's only available inside of those curly braces, not available outside of those curly braces. So what we'll have to do is define that message variable outside of our if statements so that it's accessible to all of the inner code blocks as well as our console.writeLine message here in line number 35. So it's a very simple fix. We'll just do this string message equals, and then we'll just set it to an empty string to begin with. All right, so now you'll see a different message, a red squiggly line, but we've seen this before. You can't define the same variable twice, even if it's in an inner scope. So what we'll do is just say, instead of defining the variable message there, we'll just set our existing string variable called message to the value like so. Okay, great. So now our application should run. We've eliminated a lot of code, and admittedly I created a straw man here. I wrote more code than I needed to, but I wanted to illustrate this point. So again, if we were to run the application, it works correctly. But there's one other change that we can make. Code blocks inside of, as we're using them inside of if, else if, and else statements, if there's not more than one line of code to execute, then we don't even need to use the curly braces. In other words, since there's just one line of code here underneath my if statement, I can just remove it and make it small like that, real compact. Same is true here, and same is true here. Now, in this case, maybe just to kind of illustrate why you would need the open and closing curly braces, if I were to do this, message equals message plus you lose, like so, and I'll even add a little space here to make it look correct. Let's go ahead and test that else case just real quick, and I'll type anything in there and hit enter. And says, sorry, we didn't understand, you lose. Notice that we were able to concatenate two strings together. I did it on two separate lines, don't really need to. But if I were to attempt to remove the opening and closing curly braces there, we're going to get a very different result when we run our application. So for example, if I hit 3, notice that you won a new cat, you lose. Wait, what? How? Why did that happen? You won a new cat, but you lose. Well, there is no such thing as a free cat, but at any rate, it's because what it's really seeing is this, like that. All right. If we want these two to be evaluated together inside the same code block, we have to include them in the same code block. Otherwise, this being outside of that code block will execute no matter which of these if or else if conditions are true. All right, so let's go ahead and put that back there just to kind of illustrate that idea. In fact, if we were to do something like this, I can even make this a little bit smaller. Let's comment that out. And I'm going to show you a new operator, which is just this. Okay. So now instead of going message equals message plus you lose, essentially I'm saying give me whatever's in the variable message, concatenate on the word you lose, and then assign that back into the variable message. That's what I did here. I just do it all in one step right there where I say whatever's in the variable message, on the end of that concatenate you lose. So this is the assignment and concatenation operator kind of combined into one. Okay, just a little shortcut there. All right, so now let's do this. Let's talk about another style of of decision statements. It's actually an operator called the conditional operator. And this works well if you have an if or else kind of scenario and you don't have multiple items to evaluate like we did here. So I'm going to copy some code from lines 14 and 15. Whoops. Yeah, and line 16 too. Let's just copy all of those and we're going to paste them down below our commented area. All right. And then what I'm going to do is this. This. We'll do this a little bit different this time. Okay, there we go. Now I've written a lot of extra code that I need to. I'm going to show you how to shorten this up in just a moment. All right, so here the key to this is this little evaluation that I'm doing on line number 42. Remember that we're going to evaluate anything in between the parentheses whenever we see the double equal sign. That means we're doing an evaluation. Is the user value that they typed in and submitted through the previous line of code, line number 40, is it equal to the literal value 1? If that is true, if this equates to true, then what we want to do is everything after the question mark, we're going to take that value and assign it to our new variable called message. All right, so if the user types in 1, we'll find the word boat, the literal string boat, and we'll assign it to the variable message. However, if this equates to false, so they type in something different, then anything after the colon will be taken and assigned to the variable message, and we'll use that below. So let's go ahead and run the application. We'll run it twice. We can choose a door, and if they choose door number 1, they win a boat. However, if we run the application a second time and we choose anything else, then you'll only win a strand of lint. Again, this is only useful in a if-else condition, not when you have multiple conditions to evaluate. All right, now let's address this last little part here because I can shorten this up considerably. Notice in order to get it all to print out on one line, I only use console.write. And so then I typed out the literal string, and then I have a second line where I'm actually then printing out the actual message from line 42, and then finally to add a period at the end, I'm having to do yet another console.write statement in order to add a period. Okay, I can shorten all that up in one line of code. Watch how I do this. In fact, let's go ahead and I'll comment out these lines individually like so, and then I'm going to use a replacement character inside of the console.write line in order to shorten this up a little bit. So we'll use a write line instead, and we'll put U1A, and then I'm going to use what I call a replacement code. So a replacement code of 0, and then after I give it that literal string, I'm going to use a comma, and then give it the actual message variable that I want. Whatever's inside of this, I want it replaced in here. Okay, so eliminate that the curly braces with the 0 and put the message variable value inside of there. So let's run the application again just to see this working. I'm going to type the number 1 and get the same result. All right. Now, what if we wanted to expand on this idea here? Let me comment that out. And what if I wanted to replace 2 values inside of that console.write line string? So let's do something like this. You entered, and then we'll go 0, Therefore, U1 A. All right. And so in this case, after the comma, I'm going to enter the user value and then the message here. Let's make sure you can see that. All right. Hopefully you can see that all on screen at one time. So I need to do one little thing here is change that to a 1. All right. So this says take the first item. So in software development, typically you don't start with the number 1, you start with the number 0. I don't know. So we're going to see this pop up again and again. So the first item in the list will be at element 0. The second item in the list will always be at element 1, and so on. All right. So the very first item, this will be matched and replaced by the very first item in that comma delimited list of input parameters after the literal string, that little template that we created for ourselves. Then here we're going to do a second replacement and replace that with whatever's inside of the message variable. So when we run the application and we type in the number 1, said you entered 1, therefore you won a boat. Awesome. All right. Okay, so that's enough for one lesson. Hopefully you've learned a couple of important things in this lesson. First of all, we talked about the if decision statement as well as the else if and the else, and how to do a comparison, an evaluation between two values to determine true or false. If we're using an if statement and we're doing that evaluation, then anything, the code that is in the code block below it will get executed if that evaluation is true. If it's not, it'll either drop down to a second and subsequent evaluation or even do a catch-all in the else statement. We talked about using curly braces for a code block versus when you don't need them. We talked about keeping your code nice and tidy and small. We talked about declaring variables inside of scope and inner scope and outer scope as defined by our curly braces for code blocks. We talked about the conditional operators, being able to all in one line do a check for true or false, and if it's true, assign one value versus a different value to a new variable. We talked about format codes inside of literal strings for our console.write line and how to replace those replacement codes with variable values that we then also pass in our console.write line statement, like you see here at the very bottom in line number 49. Okay, so again, covered a lot of ground. Hopefully this all makes sense. If not, rewatch the video, just watch those portions that didn't make sense. Make sure you're typing in the code yourself so that you can come to some of these epiphanies as you're typing. Okay, all right, we'll pick it up in the next lesson. See you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, I want to spend a bit more time talking about some smaller syntax elements of the C# language that you need to master to understand how a properly formed line of code is constructed in C#. And in one of the previous lessons, almost like the first lesson, I said something to the effect that just like you use a period or question mark or exclamation mark at the end of a sentence in English to complete a thought, you also use a semicolon at the end of a line of code in C# to denote a complete thought. And kind of to extend that analogy a little bit, I may have briefly referred to C# syntax as having nouns and verbs. So I want to elaborate on these sorts of things and clarify what I mean by that in this lesson. So I'm going to talk about the basic building blocks and I guess you could say parsing the parts of speech in C#. So let's start off at the beginning. Statements are what you call complete thoughts in C#, typically one line of code. A statement is made up of one or more expressions. And expressions are made up of one or more operators and operands. So we've seen a number of statements and expressions in operators and operands already, whether you realized it or not. So as we're taking a look at some of the previous work that we've done, here I've got the variables project from a previous lesson opened up. And so, for example, you can see that essentially each line of code is a statement. Each of them are made up of one or more expressions. So here, for example, is an example expression. This happens to be a variable declaration statement made up of a operator, which in this case is a keyword int for the data type integer, and then an operand, in this case a variable name. We also use another operator, the semicolon, for the end of the line of code. Another example would be here where we have an assignment where we're actually calling a method. So here is an operand. It is the name of a class, and we're using the open close parentheses. Remember, these are operators. This is the method invocation operator. Then we're using another operator here, the assignment operator, to assign this expression, the value of this expression, to another operand, the name of a variable that we created. All right. So if we were to look through the code, we could continue to kind of parse out and understand what makes up operands, operators, expressions, and then entire code statements. Now, operands are similar to nouns. They are things like objects and classes and variables and even literal values. These are the subject, I guess you could say, of your statement of code. And they're pretty easy to remember because typically you give them names, you define the values yourself, and so on. Now, operators are similar to verbs. They are things like the addition operator or the string concatenation operator. These are things that act on the operands in order to perform some action. And typically you're going to use the built-in operators, although you could create your own operators, kind of a little bit of an advanced topic, but there are actually quite a few built-in operators, and you're going to need to memorize many of them. That's how you come to express yourself in C#. Now, fortunately, as you start out, you probably only need to know a handful to be productive. And so what I want to do in this lesson is to focus on a few that I think you're going to use probably 90% of the time as you begin learning, and you can obviously add to that list as we continue. So I'm going to actually present these in a rapid-fire fashion. I've created a very nonsensical application. You can open this up, download it from wherever you're currently watching this video or wherever you originally downloaded it from. I called this project Operators Expression Statements, and the application itself does absolutely nothing meaningful at all, okay? And so all it really does is kind of show you some examples of the various operators and expressions that you'll come across whenever you're working in C#. All right, so at the very outset here, you can see that I have a variable declaration. We talked about this already. I did something a little bit different this time, where I've declared several variables all up front as integers. So X, Y, A, and B are all defined as integers. Just wanted to show you something a little bit different there. By separating them with commas, it's an easy way to just to declare several variables of the same type all on one line of code. Now, I typically don't recommend this, but you might see this around in use in books and on the internet. All right, so next up, assignment operator. We've already seen the equal sign at work in that capacity. Note here in line number 22 and following that there are actually many different mathematical operators. We're only looking at the most basic ones, but there are also some advanced ones as well. But here we have addition and subtraction, multiplication and division. And as I demonstrate here, you can use parentheses to actually change the order of operations. So these are not, in this particular situation, the parenthesis is not a method invocation operator. It's actually a how you would typically use it in an algebraic or mathematical sense. You would use it in order to specify the order of operations. So perform this expression first, then this expression, and then take the results of those two and multiply them together in that third expression, and then assign them to the value of x. Okay. And then there are operators that are used to evaluate. We've already talked about the equality operator, where we're using two equal signs next to each other to make sure that these two items are in fact equal. Here again we're using parentheses in yet a different capacity to define the boundaries of our expression that will either equate to true or false. So x equals y is either true or false. We can use greater than, we can use the less than operator, we can use greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. All of these, again, should produce a true or false result. There are also two conditional operators that can be used to expand or enhance an evaluation, and they can be combined together multiple times, as I say here in the comments. So I could ensure that both x is greater than y is true and a is greater than b is true by using the logical AND operator. There's also an OR operator to say either x has to be greater than y or a has to be greater than b in order for this outermost expression to be true. All right, so here's the logical OR, two pipe characters next to each other. All right. So, and then I guess we've already talked about that inline conditional operator where we have some item that's being evaluated, and then if it's true, then we'll take the first value, and if it's false, then we'll take the second value. And in this case, we're assigning either car or boat into this message variable's value. And then also wanted to talk about member access and method invocation. We're going to talk about object-oriented programming quite a bit later on in this series of lessons, but we've already said how the console was a class, and classes are containers, for a lack of a more robust definition, for methods, and the way that you access a member method of a class or an object is by using the dot or the period. That is the member accessor operator. Furthermore, we talked about the method invocation operator. Here we are invoking a method called writeLine by using the opening and closing parentheses. And in this particular case, we're passing in an input parameter. Again, we want to hold off and talk about input parameters and methods a little bit later. But as you can see, here's a number of different operators, and these are just what I would call a very baseline set. You need to memorize these so that you can express the most basic of C# commands and understand exactly what it is that you're trying to do. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but you will probably need these about 90–95% of the time. And then you can expand your vocabulary of other operators and keywords over time. So in each of these cases that we just looked at, an expression is made up of a combination of operands, which are things like the literal strings and variables, and objects like the console class itself, and operators. So things like the addition operator, string concatenation operator, equality, assignment operators, and so on. And you use expressions then to form complete thoughts, statements in C#, which are how the actions or the instructions of an application are expressed to the compiler and ultimately to the .NET runtime, which executes your application. All right. So why am I telling you all of this? Why go through this little English lesson, you know, parsing out the different parts of speech if you've ever had to take an English class? Well, it will help you to understand why this is not a valid statement in C#. You can't just type x plus y and then give it a end-of-line character and expect it to do anything. The C# compiler will look at that and say, what are you trying to accomplish here? Have you lost your mind? What do you want me to do with all this? So Fortunately, in situations like these, as you can see, Visual Studio can catch these sorts of syntactical mistakes even before you attempt to run the application. And if we were to hover our mouse cursor over the visual guidance here, the red squiggly line, you can see that the fundamental problem with this line of code is that only assignment, call, increment, decrement, and new object expressions can be used as a statement. So what's the problem here? Well, this is not a properly formed statement. We're not assigning, calling, incrementing, decrementing, or creating new object expressions. What? We're not formulating a complete thought, a good sentence. I mean, I could create an English sentence like this: the red ball, period. And you would say, the red ball does what? Who has the red ball? Okay. We can understand that just because you use words doesn't mean you're creating a complete thought or expression inside of the English language. Same thing is true with C#. All right, that's all I'm trying to say here. So for beginners, understand that there's a proper syntax, just like there's a proper grammar in the English language. Understanding this is really a big step towards solving your own problems whenever you're phrasing C# instructions that the C# compiler will understand and accept and ultimately compile into code that will be run by the .NET Framework. So here, let's recap what we talked about in this lesson. First of all, statements are complete instructions in C#. They consist of expressions. And a statement is like a sentence in the English language, and expressions are composed of things like nouns and verbs, in other words, operators and operands. The operands are things like nouns. They're the subject or what we want to do something with. And then there are the operators, which are more like the verbs. These will act on the nouns to perform some action. We said that operands are like variables and classes, literal strings. These are things that we get to name ourselves. They give the meaning to our application, whereas operators are, for the most part, built into the language, and we have to memorize them. And so to start off, you might use something like what I've given you here in the form of a project for a cheat sheet. But I think you might just be able to walk your way through and rationalize your way through now that you understand that there's a proper way to format a line of code. You might say, okay, what do I need to do here? And you might be able to reason your way through the operands and the operators. I'm going to need a variable to contain some values, and so once I have created that variable in memory, now I'm going to need to assign it to something. Now, how am I going to get to that something? I'm going to need to take another variable and this literal value, and I'm going to need to add them together with an operator, and hopefully you get the idea there. Okay, so I hope that this was a useful exercise. I think it's useful for beginners to understand that there are syntax rules, and they're not so unlike what you're already familiar with. Maybe they look a little bit different than your typical English sentence, but they still have to make sense, and they have to perform an action, they have to do something. And so when you see errors, sometimes it's because you type something incorrectly, and then sometimes it's you may not be using the right forms of speech, in a sense, in order to express that complete thought in C#. Okay, so let's pick it up in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, we're going to focus on iteration statements, a specific iteration statement called the for iteration statement. Sometimes you're going to need to loop or iterate through a sequence of things to find something that you're looking for, to find a successful match. And actually, you're going to do this sort of data manipulation more than you realize. So you'll have to trust me that this is a very important tool in your toolbox that you're building. So as you can see, I've already taken the liberty of creating our project. I called it for iteration. Pause the video, go through the steps that you already know how to perform to create a new project, new console window project, and catch up with me. I'm going to begin to add some code here on line 13 in just a moment. Now the syntax that we're going to write here in just a moment is possibly the most cryptic of anything that you've seen yet, and I'm going to be completely honest, sometimes I get